Today we're going to be taking a look at runtime animation for games in Unreal. So we'll be taking a look at a few concepts on how to actually build uh, essentially animation blueprints, which Unreal Engine's kind of blueprint system of handling animations. And yeah, it's something I've been basically living in for the past few months at work. So the course objective for this for runtime animation blueprints or runtime games animation, sorry, is to understand how Animation Blueprint controls animations, to create an animation blueprint from scratch. We will also make sure that we trigger animations on skeletal meshes from the pawn blueprint itself. And also we'll take a look at how we can split what animations play and what parts of the body of the skeletal mesh. So yeah, split skeletal mesh to run animation on a single section of it, which incidentally will be that little wave that you see there. And we'll also show you how to make a very, very, very basic animation using the actual animation sequence tools themselves. So, before we get into this like too deep, I want to go over some core concepts that will help you understand like where we're going to grab the information from and what actually is going on behind the scenes that you might not be seeing directly from the animation blueprint. Um, and that's the sort of overview of like how everything happens. So we've got the player controller, the controller. And remember, the controller is the thing that, or the player controller is the essentially the blueprint or the class that handles the actual behavior of the character. So how the player can actually control the character. So it directs the pawn's behavior, it handles inputs, and provides camera control as well. Now the pawn itself, so the controller directs the pawn. And that is a physical representation of the character in the world. So it will actually contain the character mesh and things like the movement components and things like that. So if you want to think of it like more conceptually, the controller wills the pawn to do the things that it can do, its abilities. So all the movement and everything like that will be stored in the pawn. And that will be again what defines the movement and the physics through the capsule. And then in the animation blueprint ecosystem itself, we've got the event graph and the anim graph. The event graph is essentially like the blueprint that you're used to already by now, I think, where you can receive data and send data to other blueprints. You can process that data. And then importantly, that data can then be used by the anim graph, which it can process. And then we can use that to actually drive the skeletal mesh animation. Um, and it also can connect data from state machines and control rigs. So we're not going to be looking at control rig in this course, but it's a really, really powerful tool. In fact, it's probably worth doing one of the labs dedicated to control rig. So now that we've starting to look at animation things, maybe this week or next week we can do some control rig in one of the live labs. But for now, we're just going to be looking at the animation blueprint. But I guess the easiest, well, telling you all of this right now, like this doesn't make too much sense, but just keep in mind that we're going to be working with the pawn and the animation blueprint to kind of send information back and forth and do fun stuff with it. Essentially, move the character. So we're going to take a look at step by step how we build animation blueprint. But just remember that the pawn or the character class holds the actual skeletal mesh. That skeletal mesh can be assigned an animation blueprint. It can be you can have multiple animation blueprints, and depending on the use of the character or the things that the character can do, you could change that if you wanted to. The animation blueprint plays the output of the anim graph, which is within the animation blueprint, and the event graph gets and interprets data from the anim graph itself. So let's take a look at how we build something. So, like I say, we don't have a specific project for this, so let's go ahead and I'll show you how you would create a new project that can handle this. So I'm going to go to my Unreal Engine launcher. And you would essentially you can go to the library, but essentially press launch. It's going to launch a version of the engine, which obviously is happening on my other screen because that's how it all goes. But all you'd really have to do is once you get this window, you go to the games, section here and just make sure you launch this third person template. Call it whatever you want. These settings can be left at default, but that's the important thing. We're basically using this template to do this project. So go ahead and grab that, and it should open up to this, which is the third person template. And I'm just going to reorganize my slides a little bit so that I can actually go in order. But yeah, essentially, we are going to be recreating what you see at the beginning of or what you see here, using the third person template. So the character that can animate and do all of these things. Because I'm not using a controller, I'm using just mouse and keyboard. We might end up adding a couple of extra things to what's on the slides just so that we can see how things are actually working and happening. But we'll get to that as we go. So to start with, I'm just going to make a new folder. I'm going to call it anim or runtime anim, just so I know it's the course. And in here, what I want to do is I'm going to duplicate the third person character here. I'm going to move it there. So just to do that, I'm just going to go to third person blueprints. I'm going to grab this character, drag it into my runtime animation, and I'm just going to copy it. And now we have a character here. I'm just going to rename this. So BP underscore my character. And then to assign to this, I'm going to go ahead and make an animation blueprint, which is what we're going to mainly be working on today. So I'm going to right click, go to animation, and then make an animation blueprint here. So I'm going to click it, and I need to assign it to the skeleton that I'm going to be working on. So the skeleton that's already in this animation blueprint is SK Mannequin, or Mannequin, I guess. So I'm just going to create that, and I'm going to call it ABP for animation blueprint, and then call it my animation blueprint, just for the sake of keeping things simple. So before we do anything, we're just gonna tidy the house a little bit. So I'm gonna open up my character here, and you can see the character has a bunch of logic already in it. Again, this handles essentially the abilities that it has, which is like camera input, movement input. Remember, the controller is what's going to be firing these events off essentially to make the pawn itself make these move left and right, move forward and backwards, jump, all that kind of stuff. But the abilities, as you can see, are actually stored in the pawn itself. So what do I want to do? I want to ensure that the mesh here is no longer using the animation blueprint that was already created. So I select the mesh. I'm going to go to the details panel, and under the anim class, I'm going to drop down, and I'm going to find my anim BP, which is the one I just created, which is completely empty. I'm going to compile and save that. So now I need to assign this character to be the thing that actually gets used. So in my world settings, which I can access by going to Window, World Settings, if they're already open for you, you've got them right here. But under the game mode, I'm just going to expand this, and I'm going to change the default pawn class, and I can just drag my character there. And now my character's default pawn class. So I'm going to save everything. I'm going to press play, and now you can see I can move. I can do all the things the pawn can do, but you can see that here we have no animation because we've not set it up to do so. So here we go. We're at the starting from scratch point. So let's see. My slides are completely all over the place, so I'll just scroll. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is first I want to take a look at the animation blueprint as a whole, just really, really basically, because remember we were talking before about the anim graph and then the event graph, and I want to take a look at those two things. So here we are. Once we open an animation blueprint, we are greeted with the anim graph, and the anim graph, like we say, is going to be essentially intaking any pose data that we create here. So for example, if I was to just grab the idle animation and drag it in here, you can see this blueprint looks a little bit different because it's got like this little pose button or little pose pins. So if I compile, you can see it's just taking in whatever poses you give it, right? And the work that we do here is basically where we're going to do everything for this animation blueprint. The event graph is like a normal blueprint, so we've got a bunch of events and things that we can use to gather data, get data, send data all the way over to the animation graph, and then it can use it to drive any behaviors that we want. And I guess the important thing is that we've got the asset browser and the anim preview editor. Asset browser just has all the animations that are assigned to the skeleton, which is really handy because we can drag them in and use them. And then if we want to preview specific things about the anim instance and see the results here in the viewport, say, for example, we want to check what happens when we tick a bool, we can change those values here and see the updates happen on the animation or on the viewport here. So it's something that you might use, but we'll probably not be touching it too much. Lastly, we've got, just like in any other blueprint, we've got all this stuff here, which is just the variables, animation layers, functions, all this kind of stuff that this side you should start to be familiar, I think, with from any other blueprints. So let's take a look at how we can start by essentially creating a setup where our character can go from idle to running through walking in the animation blueprint. So to do that, I'm going to create a blend space. Now, if you're following the slides, it will ask you to go to animation and create a blend space here. And we're just going to create it just so I can show you what it does. So we'll call it new BS new, so blend space new. The only thing about this is that it's going to ask you to define two axes, right? So the idea of a blend space is that I can put different animations and blend between them depending on the data that these two axes are driving. Now, for the exercise that we're doing today, we're only going to be looking at speed, right? So we're going from idle to running. There's no other information that we're going to take on other than speed for that. But we could take on things like direction and things like that. But again, for this exercise, we don't need to actually worry about that. So it doesn't really make much sense to me to have a 2D blend space for this. So instead of creating the 2D blend space, which is default, I'm going to delete it and I'm just going to go to animation, go to legacy and blend space 1D. And they're essentially the same thing. It's just that we won't have a pin that says none that's a little bit awkward when you look at it in the blueprint. So we're just going to do this. So BS, and this is going to be walk run. That's what we're going to call it. And I'm actually going to put my on there so that in case there's any other that have been created. So here we've got the blend space editor, and it looks very much like a normal animation editor, except that it's got this sort of bottom section here, which is the blend space and what it's going to look at. So in order to change what this information here from the blend space, or the grid of the blend space, we're going to go on the left-hand side here, and we've got a couple of options. Like you can see the axis settings. If I expand this, I can change the name of the axis. Again, we're going to be driving this with speed, so I'm just going to name this speed for ease of use. And I'm going to change the maximum axis value to 500. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because the value or the run speed that the character actually has, if I open up the character blueprint and I look at the character movement component, I can see that the max walk speed is 500 centimeters a second, so 500 units a second. So I just want to be able to make sure that this animation scales to the speed that the character actually has. If you wanted to be a little bit fancier, you could just leave it at 100 or even go from 0 to 1, and then basically in the blueprint figure out whether you have to divide by the actual max walk speed and have that be run automatically. But for now, just to simplify things, we're just going to change it to the hard-coded value that's here, and we can go from there. So now all I have to do is drag in the animations that I want to be using. So I'm going to drag the idle at speed 0. I'm going to drag it in there, and you can see I can move this pin here now. But I'm just going to put it all the way to the left. And one thing I'm going to do as well is take use grid, and that way the Animations will also snap to grid if I tick that there. So now you can see instead of it being kind of completely free moving, it snaps to each one of those sort of grid sections. Then I'm going to grab the walk. So I'm going to walk right there. So halfway through the speed, I'm going to get to walk, and then I'm going to drag the run and put it at the end there. So I've got a run forward animation, I've got a walk animation, and I've got an idle animation. Now to preview how this blends through the value of speed, so when speed is at 0, I'm going to be playing the idle. When speed is at 500, I'm going to be playing the run, and at 250 right in the middle. If I hover over them, you can see the values. I'm going to be walking. So if I hold control now, I can actually drag that little X and it'll show me how I'm blending through those values. Right? So all the way to running. And then all the way back down. So this is what we're going to use to essentially drive 3 animations with whatever the speed of the character is, and play the appropriate animation depending on the speed. It might be worth, for example, moving this one to here so that you walk quicker and then spend a little longer to get to the run. But that's up to you where you want to put this walk speed. Ideally, you put it at whatever the walk speed was authored for, but generally it should work okay. So with these settings, I'm not really going to do anything more. I'm going to close this. I'm also going to close my character because I don't need it right now. And I'm going to open up the animation blueprint because we're going to essentially take a look at creating the animation blueprint for this now. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start creating a state machine because we're going to handle not only walking and running, we're also going to try and handle jumping and all that stuff. So we'll start by making the state machine. But for now, let's just make sure that everything actually works with the running and walking. So I am going to create a state machine. So right click, search for state machine. And I'm going to call this locomotion. And for those of you who don't know what a state machine is, it essentially allows you to create different states or different nodes which have a state, be it idle, running, jumping, or whatever that is, and then allows you to transition between states depending on some rules that you can define. For now, we're just going to allow it to play that idle to run locomotion. So I'm going to drag out of the entry pin here in the inside of the state machine, and I'm going to add a state. And this state is going to be called walk run. Again, this also includes the idle, but I'm not going to call it idle walk run. That seems very like too much. So I'm going to double click this here. And now all I need to do is bring my blend space into this. And we should be good to go. Now, if you look on the right-hand side on the asset browser, you'll see I can't find the blend space. That's because we've got this filter on here, use the skeleton notify. If you just take that off, you can see all of the blend spaces or all of the things that you actually have available. And in our case, I've got this BS my walk run. I'm going to drag that in and connect it like so. Now you'll notice that this is asking for information on the speed of the character, right? Remember, this value is what's going to drive whether I'm playing a walk-in or a run-in or an idle animation. So right now it's just set to 0. By the way, that name that appears here on the node will be dictated by whatever you've called the horizontal axis. So if I call this potato, you'd see potato here. So we have an idle now. So if I quickly play, you can see I can move and I've got an idle. Now we've not fed any information to that speed. So there's nothing for us to actually drive whether we're walking or running or playing the idle. So for now, we're just playing the idle. So if I go back here, I need to feed information about the speed. Now, the information about the speed of the character is going to be found in the character blueprint or the pawn, right? So we're going to have to grab the information from it. So we're going to go to the event graph and we're going to find a node called initialize animation. And this essentially is a little bit like begin play, but for animations. So from that, I'm just going to grab this node, like borrow it from the update animation, because what I'm going to do is cast to my third person character and then grab the information from it. So I'm going to drag out of here. So I'll try get pawn owner, and I'm going to cast to BP my character. Now that we have my character, remember this is this blueprint, I can access all the stuff that's in here. So what I can access right now, what I want to access is the character movement component, which has that information about the speed. So if I drag out of here and search character movement, I can get it. And what I'm going to do is, because I want to store this, because I want to be able to access it at all times, I am going to right click on this and promote it to a variable. And we're going to call it, to be fair, character movement is a perfectly fine name. So we're going to do that. Okay, so we have the character movement. Now it's important that anything that I do now, this happens at begin play, right? Essentially. So any information that I want to get from the character movement, if I grabbed it here, I'd only grab it at begin play. But for something like speed that's going to be adjusting the animation of that should be playing constantly, I want to do it as we update the animation. So I'm going to use this node here, event update blueprint animation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that character component and I will drag out of it. And to get the speed, essentially I need the velocity of the character, which will give me both the speed and the direction that the character is going in. So I'll get velocity right at the bottom here.
Yeah, James, just before you go too fast, a
Yep.
lot of people I think are falling behind a little bit, so if you could just slow down a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. Should I retrace a few steps? Lucas, can you unmute yourself if you're talking?
Sorry, yeah, just the way you're getting the character movement. I think
Okay,
that's where people got stuck. Yeah.
cool. So let's redo that. I'll just delete it. And we'll delete our character movement as well. So first of all, I want to get the character blueprint and I want to make a cast to that my character blueprint that I created before, because that's the one that contains the information about the character's movement, right? That's the character movement component right there. That's what I'm looking for. But I want to access it within my animation blueprint so I can feed information to this walk run blend space that I created. So we're going to be updating the speed here. We just need to grab the actual speed information of the character. So to do that, I'm going to go to my event graph, and I just want to grab my character movement so that I can then use it wherever I want. So I'll grab it at the beginning of when the animation gets initialized. So to do that, I'm going to right click and I'm going to search for uh, initialize animation, which is the event that will fire. It's a little bit like I say, a little bit like a begin play, but for animation blueprints. And what I need to do is I'm going to use the node that was already grayed out here, but because I've deleted it, I'll just find it again. So I'm going to try and get the pawn owner. Try to get pawn owner. So this will attempt to get whoever is actually used in this animation blueprint. In our case, it's going to be my character, right? Remember the mesh is using this animation blueprint. So I'm going to get that. And to access its properties, I have to cast to it. So I'm going to cast to BP my character. That's the third person character that I duplicated. So now, as my character, right, I can access the character movement. So to do that, I'm just going to drag out of there and get character movement. And when you get in, it always appears right at the bottom. It's just a variable. So I'm just going to click it there. And again, because I want to be getting the speed and information about the character movement constantly, this initialized blueprint animation, I'm only doing it to cache, essentially to have access to the character movement component. So I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to promote it to a variable so I basically have access to it whenever I want it. So now the blueprint starts, we get the character movement and then use it wherever you want, right? So in our case, we're going to use it as the animation updates because it's speed information, right? We want to be able to be reactive to that as the speed of the character changes. We want to know which animation we should be playing. So I'm going to get that character movement that I just promoted to a variable. And to get the speed, essentially, I need to get the velocity of the character, which gives you information about both the speed and the direction that the character is going in. So I'm going to get velocity. And all the way at the bottom here, we've got get velocity. So again, this gives me a vector 3, which is essentially information about the speed and the direction that the character's going in. Now, I only need to understand the speed for this. So I can drag out a velocity and I can get vector length. And you might not need to have get there, just vector length. And this is going to give me the velocity of the character, or the speed of the character, sorry. You can also, if you want to, ignore the Z component if you don't want to have like any speed influenced by the Z axis, for example, while you're jumping. So you just want to get the ground speed. So you can also get vector length XY. So that just gives you the X and Y components. So essentially the 2D on the ground speed, right? So the ground speed of the character. So now that I have that, I can just right click and promote to variable. I'm not going to call this speed. And I'll get rid of this other node just to not confuse things. They both will essentially do the same thing. It's just with this one, we're ignoring the vertical component of the speed or velocity. And as the animation updates, so constantly, essentially, this is the event tick of the animation blueprint, we will update the value of the speed, which we're getting from the character movement and its velocity, right? So now that we have speed, we can go back to our anim graph. So I'm going to double click the anim graph. We'll go back to the locomotion, back to our walk run state. And in here, now I can feed that speed variable. So I'm going to grab speed and pop it in. So now the speed of the character is going to be driving this blend space. And remember, the speed of the character can get up to 500. So as I play now, you'll see I play the appropriate animation for the speed that I'm running at.
Yeah, could you just redo that, James? I think a few people got lost. Just which windows you would jump in between.
Yeah. So remember, I grabbed the speed information of the character, so now I need to use it. And to use it, I need to use it in the state machine that I assigned that blend space. So just again, I'm going to go to my anim graph, double click it. We'll go into the locomotion or state machine that I made. And then remember, we were using that blend space in this walk run. So if I open this up, now I can just connect that speed. It might look like this for you if you haven't got this far. So I can just grab speed, get it, and connect it. It might be that you have it on one of the tabs here as well. So if you find your walk run state, you should be able to just hop onto it from there. We'll put this back on the anim graph. Does anyone have any questions? Anything I can go over for now?
I think people are typing questions now.
Okay, I'll give people like a couple minutes to type something up.
So what's the benefit of storing the character movement variable in the animation VP rather than the game mode?
What's the sorry of putting the of storing the movement component in
The
the animation blueprint rather
Yeah,
than the game mode?
yeah.
Well, I'm not sure why you would ever use it in the game mode. Essentially, I need in this blueprint, which is going to handle my animation, I need to have the information of the character movement. So I might as well have it here instead of having to communicate to the game mode, who would be communicated to the pawn to get that information. So you'd be doing like a 3-step communication instead of just one. So that's why I'm putting the character movement here, because I'm not really sure why you'd want it on the game mode. But you definitely want it in the animation blueprint where you're actually going to be using information from it directly, right? So that's why I'm storing it here.
James, sorry, are you getting the error when you stop the playing editor that the character movement might not be valid at some point?
I don't think so, but no.
Mm.
If you are getting the error, it could be that you're using begin play instead of initialize animation. I know that sometimes essentially begin play might fire off a frame before initialize animation, so you might not get it right on the first tick.
Yeah, that's the case. Yeah,
that might be the issue.
Thank you.
And then there's a question about the blend space and how you set up that node within the actual state machine.
Okay, yeah, I could just really quickly go over it again. So I'll go over making a state machine again. So I'm going to right click state machine. I'll make a state machine. I'll leave it as new state machine for now as the name. Remember, this is happening in the anim graph, okay? If you can't find your anim graph, by the way, you've got all your graphs here. So under animation graph, the forward shared group, you've got the anim graph right there. So enter this, and inside of the state machine, I'm going to create a new state that's going to call walk run. And I'm going to enter that state. And now this is expecting an animation pose of which I'm going to use my blend space. Now, if you can't find your blend space in the asset browser, there's two ways you can bring it in. One, untick this filter and allow you to find it right at the bottom if you created it just last. Or you can literally just find it in your content browser and drag it in. That works too. So now all I need to do is connect the output pose of that blend space in there. But remember, now I have to feed that speed information that we did in the event graph here, right? So to feed that speed information, all I have to do is find the variable that I created doing all of this. And I can drag it in, get the speed, and pop it in there. There's another way of actually popping these on, which is if you just select the node, you can just pin it, like bind it directly in here. So you can bind it to directly the speed. So that also works, but it's not as readable for a lesson. So I think it's better to just connect it like that. Are we good to go? Any more questions? Okay, so hopefully everyone's right about this point where they can actually have their character run. If you're using a controller, you should be able to just push in the controller a little bit and the character should walk. But remember, we're basically going straight to the max walk speed of the character, so straight to run because I'm using mouse and keyboard, right? There's no sort of nuance on that. Okay. So next, we can take a look at handling jumping. Again, just going to check that there's no questions before I start moving to jumping. Anything else, or are we good to go? Okay, I'll keep going.
I think we're good. A few people have. It's just not working for them, but I'm not sure if we can just figure that out during a lab.
Yeah. I mean, this lecture actually is not that big, so we can actually take a look at the stuff on the lab in a second. So I'm going to make a little bit of room and space here because I want to actually create or essentially know when the character is in the air. That's what I need to know, right? Now, really handily, Unreal Engine's movement component already has that information inside. So I just need to get that information from the movement component. Now, for the sake of cleanliness, I'm just going to put a sequence node in here. So S and left click. And it'll allow me to just do things a little bit cleaner where I can figure the rest of the information I need down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the character movement component to get information about whether the character is in the air. And I know that if the character is falling, essentially. So if I find for is falling, or search for is falling, we have a little function here that's going to give us whether the character is falling or not. So with that information, I'm going to right click and promote that true or false information to a variable, and I'm going to call it is falling. So now I have access to whether the character is falling directly from the character movement component. And I'm just going to connect it like that. So now we're going to go back to the state machine and take a look at setting everything up. So back to the state machine again. I just went through it through the tabs I already had opened, but if you need to, you go to the animation graph, go to locomotion, and now we have our states. Now the way we handle jumping is usually done with a jump start, then a jump loop, and then a land animation, right? So why do we split it up into these three animations? And the truth is that you don't know how long the character might be falling for, right? It's not like you just can always just jump a certain amount and fall the same amount. We might have to loop if the character jumps off a cliff and has to be playing that loop of falling for longer and longer and longer, right? So we're going to take a look at how we might set that up. So I'm going to drag out of my walk run, and I'm going to make another state. And this is going to be my jump start. Then there's going to be the second state, which is going to be the jump loop, where the character's constantly looping and they're falling. So we're going to call this falling loop. You can also call it jump loop. And then we're going to play a land animation once the character actually lands. And then back to our walking and running. Okay. So you'll notice that it's created these little transition nodes, right? And these are essentially going to be the rules that allow the player to go from one state to the next state, right? For now, we're going to leave them blank. Let's go ahead and fill in each of these states with what we need to have in them, and then we'll see how we go from there. So the jump start, I'm going to go in here, and what do we want? Well, I'll turn my filter back on, and we just need our jump animation. So our jump animation goes in there. Now we're going to go back up a level, and we're going to take a look at the falling loop. So this time we need the constant loop of falling, right? So I'm going to find fall loop and plug it in. Now this one's a little bit different. I need to go to the details and tell it to actually loop, because if not, it will just play once and then never come back to it. So we want to be able to continue that loop. And then landing, we want to play our land animation. Now you'll notice this is a little different, and it's green. And I'm going to explain to you why that is in a bit, but for now we'll let it break things. You'll notice that I'm getting a bunch of warnings here that's saying, hey, you'll never be able to enter jump start because you have no enter transition, right? So we're just going to have to make the rules now for when we can enter each one of those states. So let's see, when can we enter the jump start? Well, we can check, is the character falling? And if the character's falling, then we know that we're jumping or starting that action. So let's go ahead, and if the character is falling, start playing that animation. Then it'll start playing jump start. Then going in from jump start to the loop, we want to go into the loop when this animation for jump starting is actually finishing playing, right? So I'm going to go into that transition, double click in it, and I'm going to get time remaining. So from the jump start, get relevant anim time remaining. And we're going to say that if there's less than 0.1 seconds left of this animation, less or equal to 0.1 seconds, which is essentially pretty much finished, we will allow you to transition to that animation. So we go into the loop now. So let's see. Are we falling? If we are, do your jump start. Then once there's less than 0.1 seconds left of this animation, we enter the loop. And then we want to essentially exit the loop when we're no longer falling, right? So we're going to go into this transition, and we're going to get is falling. And we're going to say, are we not falling? And if we're not falling, we can enter the land animation because we will have just landed. And from land animation to walk run, we'll actually just allow it to go in. So play the land and transition, like blend into the walk run as you land. So let's go ahead and save that. So to allow it to transition fully, I just need to tick this to true so that that transition is always allowed. So notice that we'll never be able to go from falling to walk, right? It's always going to follow this flow. So we're going to follow to jump start, loop, land, and then walk and run again. So we're going to do that. We're going to play this, and it's going to be a little bit broken. And the reason for this is when I press jump, I actually do the start, but you can see my character scales down once I land, right? And we're going to go ahead and fix that. And the reason for that is, remember that green node that I called out before on the land? This is essentially an additive animation. So we need to play it as an additive animation. So in order to do that, we need to get this blend space that we've been using before, which is the walk run. We'll feed it the speed information again, and we're going to add the land onto it. So apply additive. And our additive animation is going to be that land animation. So now instead of playing an additive not additively, we're actually going to be played the way that the additive animation would be expected to play. So if I save this now and play, I can walk, jump, and land. Okay.
Hey James, could you just go through the jump?
I'm going to go through
Logic
all of it
again.
again in
Yeah,
a second, so
nice.
don't worry.
Yeah.
I just want to do one last thing, and it's that you'll notice that the land animation doesn't play for long. And the reason for this, if I go one level up, is that the transition from land to walking happens over 0.2 seconds. That's if I select these nodes, I get all the blend transition information. So 0.2 seconds is really short, right, to play an animation. So I'm just going to give this something like 0.5 seconds so that we get to see that land animation a little bit more. So jump, and now the land plays a little bit, so we get to see it. And it might be a bit exaggerated, but. And let's just test that our loop actually works. So if we jump off a little bit longer, it does work. But let's check it properly. So we'll place the character here and we can jump off the cliff. And you can see we're playing our loop. Well, we get killed too quickly, but we play our loop. Let's go ahead and make a second wall. And even a third one so we can actually see it. The character's getting killed too quickly. So we can see, yeah, our loop is working, our land is working. All working correctly. So let's take a look at this logic all over again because I realized we did quite a lot. So remember when we started this, we had a locomotion setup where we just had our walk run blend space, right? But now we've added information about new states, right? Essentially allowing me to jump, fall, land, all that kind of information. So in order to get whether I should enter a jump, I need to be in my event graph. I need to grab that information off the character movement component. Now, if the character movement component tells me that isFallen is true, I'll set a variable here. So I promoted this to a variable. I'll set isFallen to true, and then make sure that that's constantly updating. Hey, are you true? Are you true or not? Right? Because we want to know at the time that something's happening. We can't just make events for this really. There's too much that could happen. So we basically have it on tick on update animation. So we now know whether we're falling or not. So if we go back to the anim graph, I'm going to close all these tabs so it's a little bit less confusing for people. And inside my state machine, I created a few states. To create a new state, I can just drag out of the state that I want to go from and make a new state, right? So we created the jump start state, which allows us to play the jumping animation. Inside of this, all there is the actual jumping animation. So I just grabbed the animation for jump, which is that one, dragged it in, and connected it to the output. The next state is going to be our loop. Remember, we don't know how long we're going to be in the air for, so we need to be able to actually do a loop for falling. And that loop is going to be fall loop. That's the animation that we're using. So we drag it in. Now, importantly, this animation needs to be able to loop because we might be falling for, more than the actual animation time. So select the node and loop animation ticked. Then the next thing is landing. Once we finish that loop and we've actually landed on the floor, we are no longer falling. So we play land. Now land's a little bit different because land, we want to be able to apply additively because if the character lands and continues running, we don't want to be playing land, slide on that animation and then start running. We want to just be able to play it at the same time as the running, right? So we're going to do this additively. So this animation's already set up as an additive animation, right? So we need to be able to use that. So what do we want to add it to? We want to add it to we're back on the ground, so we want to be back on the running and walking, right? So this animation here gets applied additively with the blend space. So all I did here was we'll recreate it. We get the land. We get the blend space, which I'm just going to drag in from here. Now remember, the blend space needs that speed information. We've already done this, so we can grab the speed and connect it directly onto there. And now we need to apply that additive animation on top. So we're going to drag out of the my walk run. We're going to apply additive. And we will have our land as our additive. And that's essentially our setup for this. Now this load looks a little bit bigger. That's because it's connected and I've compiled. But if I connected this and compiled, you see the same thing happens. Okay. Again, we just need these. Now the transitions are as follows. When do I want to start my jump start? Well, as soon as this falling is true, I want to have played a jump animation. So I'm checking whether this falling is true. If it's true, you can enter the transition. You can start the jump start. Now, from jump start to the loop, I want to make sure that I've played all of the jump start animation and then start looping. So in order to do that, I'm going to check how long is left. So get relevant anim time remaining for jump start. How long is left of the animation? And if that is less than 0.1 seconds, then I'll allow you to start transition into that loop, right? So get time remaining, and I found it here, get relevant anim time remaining. And if that is less or equal to 0.1, then I can enter that transition, okay? Once that condition is true. Then when do we want to exit the loop? As soon as we land, right? As soon as we're no longer falling, we want to start playing that land animation. So we're going to check whether is falling is not true. And if it isn't true, allow it to land. And now the land, remember, we're doing this a little bit weird because we're playing that land animation on top of the walk and run, right? So actually play the land and start transitioning directly into walk and run. So there's no real condition here. As long as you start landing, you should start to run and walk as well. So we just allow that transition to happen straight away so that we can get back to our normal state. And what we did to make that land animation be like play a little bit more obviously, we just made this transition a tiny little bit longer. So on the blend settings, we have it to 0.5, so it just blends over a little bit longer time. And that's it. Are there any questions about this setup? Do I need to go over it again? Anything? All good?
There is someone writing a question.
Okay.
Where is the blend setting to add more time?
Yeah, so that is inside of the transition node. So if you select the transition node, you'll see here in the details panel on the blend settings duration. So I've got that transition selected. Now, you could do that for all of these, by the way. You can have a much longer transition. In fact, let's take a look at what a transition for jump start would look like if I had a whole second of transition, right? So I press play. Now it's going to take a whole second to jump. So it plays it really slow, that jump, right? You can see it's not very nice. So for actions that are really instant, you do want that sort of low blend time. So over 2.2 seconds when already in the animation. But for some of them that you might want to play a little bit longer so that you can see the land a little bit more, 0.5, we're already running and walking, so we're good to go. Any other questions?
Yeah, there's one question about if we're making a non-humanoid character, would we set it up the same way?
Yeah, if you're going with a state machine, yeah, you can definitely do it. One thing we're not discussing right now, which is kind of a little bit of an elephant in the room if you've been following animation developments in Unreal Engine, soon as that, we've got motion matching ability now. So you might want to take a look at that system, which is a little bit newer. It only just got released with 5.4, so it's very new. We could do a lab about motion matching if people are interested in that as well. I'll be doing a talk about it in at Unreal Fest, so if you're there, you could come to that. But yeah, state machines, essentially all the work that we're doing animation-wise, animation blueprints are where you're going to be doing it, and state machines are a good way to handle whether a character is in a particular state and how to get them into that state. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
And there was one about if you have some more complex animations, you have a locomotion system, and then you have a couple of different attacks for a character, for example.
Mm.
How would you blend that?
It totally depends on how you want to handle those attacks. Like if so that's difference between attacks that like I could do while I'm running, right? And I can swipe at something. So if it's kind of like just an attack that doesn't require the whole character to generate the pose, then you can do it with the layered blend per bone, which we're going to take a look at in a little bit. The other way of handling this is through, and likely the more typical way of handling this is through animation montages, which again we're going to take a look at in just a second. But they essentially allow you to make a montage of animations that you can play and enter specific sections of at a particular time or with some particular logic. So it's different to state machines where you have a flow to them. Montages allow you to kind of jump to different sections wherever you want, and they're handled in a different way. But they're, for example, a place where you'd handle things like combos and things like that, especially if they take over the whole body. You can do them at the same time, like and layer them as well, but just they're generally more used as an overall thing, as a sort of full body take up. As I'm saying that, that's not really true. Like you can use them however you want. It's up to you. It's just that more typically you see them used like that, but there's nothing stopping you from using a montage and then just blending the right arm only, for example, if you wanted to. So we'll take a look at montages in a little bit, but you'll probably have more questions once you see that.
That was a quick one, just on the land state.
Yep.
People don't understand why you have to blend it with the blend space.
Oh, okay. So let's go. So I'm gonna not blend it. I'm just gonna play land and people will be able to see it. So I'm gonna make a duplicate of this animation and have it not additive. So I'm just making a duplicate. It's the same land, except this time it's not gonna be additive. Right? So now it's a normal animation. So if I go back to my character blueprint, I grab land one and just play it. And what I'll do is I'll play the land and allow it to play the whole thing. So we'll add a transition here that's time remaining. So and we'll do it the same. So once there's less than 0.1 seconds, we can enter back to the walk, right? So why do we have to do that? So it's easier to see it. So if I play this now, so it looks fine if I just jump and land, right? But now I'm going to be running, jumping and landing. And you get that, right? So we need to be able to play that land additively so that if the player is continuing to run, you allow them to actually do that. So we set it as an additive animation. But the problem with it set as an additive animation, if we just play the additive animation, it won't work because it's not being applied as an additive like this. So if I just play this like this, and I'll just allow it to transition now because technically it's additive, right? So if I just play this like this, you'll see my character squishes in, right? Because it's not being applied as an additive animation. So the engine's struggling to handle how to actually play this. So we go, okay, well, we need to apply it as an additive. So I want to add it to whatever I was doing here already anyways. So in order to do that, I just copy what I had there, apply it as an additive. And now we play the land as we're walking and running, which is still taking in that speed information and all that. and now it doesn't look as funky, but we still get a land. Importantly as well, I guess, so to answer the sort of question that a lot of people are probably thinking of, which is then if you're doing that, then why not just have the land here in the walk run? And the reason is because of the way the additive animations are handled. If they're not entered into a state to initialize them, they won't play from the beginning. So they might play once and then forever you won't see them again. Unless you very, very specifically handle running through the frames and all that kind of stuff, which is kind of a pain. So it's better to just do this. You're handling the same thing that you're handling here. It's really not that big a deal. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, it should be good. Cool. And if there's someone just having an issue, like if you walk, don't jump, I think the character doesn't play the land animation.
So if you walk off a surface and don't jump. It does play
Oh, it does.
on
Maybe
this
try the
setup.
smaller, yeah. Try the smaller platform.
I mean, as long as Is Falling
Yeah.
has happened, it's going to play. So it needs to run through the whole thing. So it does play it. It's just that it plays that like it stays on the jump start for a bit too long.
Yeah.
So what we can do to fix that is we can just allow exiting from the jump start much quicker. So instead of 0.1 seconds remaining, we'll allow it with 0.4 seconds. So we'll allow that exit a little bit quicker. So now we just come up to here and fall off. There you go. So we're just allowing to exit that animation quicker. That's all it is. If you want to see how this is all working, you can unhook this, have this playing here, and you can start playing. I'm going to do Shift F1. I'm just going to ensure that the character that we're looking at, the preview instance here, is MyAnim BP. So now we're looking at anything that's happening within this character. So you'll be able to see how we enter different states. So that's an easy tool to sort of debug what might actually be happening through your states. With two screens, it's much better, believe. Any other questions?
It was one more slightly like higher level one. Is like, does motion matching replace animation blueprints?
No. So motion matching is a tool for animation blueprints. It does not replace them. It doesn't replace any of this either. Like you can use state machines, motion matching. You can use all of these things in conjunction. In fact, it's likely that you will need to. So they're not a replacement. They're just a tool that handles something, especially locomotion, really well, so that you don't have to worry about all these transitions in the same way. We can, like I say, we can maybe do a lab on some very like a basic motion matching system, just so people kind of get a lay of the land. But yeah, it certainly doesn't replace animation blueprints. It's a tool within them.
And there's a fun one. I don't know if you want to leave it for later, but how would you do a double jump?
We'll leave that to later. We can
Yeah.
we can even take a look at it in the lab. But basically, you also have to. So double jumping is going to be an ability that you're going to have to put in the character, right? So that's something that we need to look at from there as well. So yeah, we'll take a look at that. But that's a good question. Yeah, we'll put that one for a lab because that actually might be fun to do. I've never actually done it, but it should be fun.
But that should be it. Should be good to go now.
Okay, cool. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is playing animation montages, which again is a way to play animations not through the state machine system, and also not just directly as a played animation. We're going to play it through a montage, which will allow us to kind of. The best way of thinking of montages is a little bit like an animation DJ. Like you can set up a bunch of animations that you can then pick and choose which one you're playing at what time, sort of thing. But they're all contained within this one nice system. And again, you don't have to go through a flow of information like you'd need for something like this. You can just jump to sections depending on what you actually need is at that specific time. So again, for things like combos, it can be really handy because the difference between light attack versus light attack as a second input or heavy attack might be different. But if you want to have all that contained in one place, montages are a good thing. So we're going to use it to just play an emote, like a little wave animation. But hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea of what is possible with it. So I'm just going to delete these tabs again. I don't want to overburden people with too much information. So first we're going to make a waving animation. So to do that, I'm going to grab the idle. I'm going to right click and I'm going to duplicate it. And I'm going to call it mm_wave. Now in here, you'll notice, you might have noticed when opening animation sequences, that we have a key button, which means that we can do some animation. Now, granted, it's going to be very basic animation. This isn't a control rig or anything that an animator would actually use to properly make animations. For stuff that's really basic, and especially if you're a technical animator and you're doing stuff like leans and things like that you're going to apply additive, you could do very easily with this sort of thing. But just a heads up that this isn't like a Premiere animation tool within the engine. That would fall more to sequencer and control rig, and that's out of the scope of this course. But for something as simple as what we're going to do now, it might be semi-okay. So to make this animation, I'm going to zoom into the timeline a little bit, and you'll notice I can't actually click the key animation or the key button, and that's because I don't actually have bones that I'm selecting to edit. So I'm going to go to under show, or sorry, character, bones, all hierarchy. Now I click a bone, you see that comes up. So with that, I'm just going to make a little wave animation. So I'm going to key the arm and the upper arm and the lower arm. Then we'll go 20 frames in, something like that. And we'll bring the arm up. Oh God. Maybe rotate it a bit as well. And key that. We're going to go with this guy. And key that. So now we have that. And then from here, we're going to go and do that and key it. That and key it. You can see I'm an animator. And that and key it. Okay, so we should have, if I just press play, we should have a little wave. It's amazing, I know. And then we can bring the arm back down, I guess. So let's stop this. We'll just bring the arm back down to play its normal idle animation. Okay, so we'll key that again. Oh wait, no. Let me undo that. I should have kept the upper arm up. Oh God. It seems like I broke this. So I'm just gonna delete the lower arm one. In fact, let me just start over again. I had it going and then I had to mess it up. So let's start that again. I'm gonna duplicate the idle. I'm gonna call it wave. And again, this isn't how you'd animate a character, right? Like you've got control rig, but I just wanted to have something quick here. I just went to character, bones, and show the whole hierarchy. And once again, we will key this guy and this guy so we can start working on them. Go 20 frames in and we'll raise the arm. And we will key that and key that. We'll bring the arm up like that and key it. There's a bit of a jump there in my rotation, so I'm just going to look at this curve. And I can look at the curve editor for this whole thing and just get rid of this jump there. So I'm going to click this little button here to, or this one here, just for the section that I'm trying to look at. And annoyingly, it's kind of, sorry guys, I don't use this tool too often, so I just want to get rid of this animation here. There we go. So this should allow now that transition to happen. And then here, we will go left and here, then right and here. We'll go left again, here, and then right again. Here. Okay, so we'll call this our animation. I don't want to spend too much more time fumbling through using this. So we've got a little wave animation. So now we want to be able to just play this, right? So in order to do it, we're going to create a montage. So to create a montage, I'm just going to go to my content browser. I'll go back to where I was working before. Runtime anim. And I'm just going to right click, animation, create animation montage. So the montage, I'm going to go ahead and once again assign to the skeleton that we're using. And animation montage, we're going to call this wave. Now the animated montage looks a lot like a normal animation previewer. And one thing that's important here is you'll notice that the slot it's got assigned here is the default group default slot. Now this is going to be important because this is going to be what defines where and when this animation gets played when using the animation blueprint. So we're just going to use the default slot. We're not going to overcomplicate things. That's what we're going to use. So what I need to do is drag in my wave animation to here. So just going to grab that wave. I'm going to pop it in there. So as this montage plays, that's what it does. Now, if I had other animations, I could drag other animations in here. So now let's imagine you've got an attack, right? So you've got light attack, right, heavy attack, heavy attack, whatever. You could set these up here and then define sections as this, and then inside the animation blueprint, jump to each section depending on what your needs are. Again, we don't need to look at that right now. This isn't part of the course either, but just wanted to let people know that that exists. But if we need to look at that in the lab, we could take a look at it as well. But basically, we have the concept of an animation that's in a montage, and we can play it, right? So there's a couple of ways that we can do this. Now, the way that's suggested on the slides is not a way that I love, but we're going to take a look at. But for now, let's go ahead and go to the animation blueprint and see how we actually would actually enact this, right? So what we need to do is make sure that we only play this wave from the waist up so that if we're still running, we don't go back into the idle. We still are able to just play that wave as the character's running. So we need to essentially create a layered system, right? Where we have animations that play on the upper body and animations that play on the lower body. So to do that, I'm going to have to use a layered blend per bone. So the base pose wants to be my locomotion here, and the blend pose is going to be my montage. Or in this case, we can't use a montage directly in here. We need to use what I've referred to before as the default slot, right? So I'd search default slot, and we could pop it in there. Now you'll notice the default slot needs a source, and the source that we want to actually plug into it is the locomotion, right? That's what we want to have as the base animation. If you had other slots, you might have other sources for this, but for this particular example, we only have the ability to walk anyways. So we need to actually feed this as the source. In order to do that, I'm going to introduce a concept that's called caching a locomotion pose, or caching a pose. So if I drag out of this and I search cache, all this does is allows me to access the information of the output impose of this whole state machine anywhere in the graph. So now if I search locomotion, It's almost like using a tag. Now I can use that as my base pose, but then I can also use it as the source for my slot. And this is actually really handy. The concept of caching poses is something that you should try and get familiar with, because you'll be able to do quite a lot of things by, being able to move around whatever poses you're working with. Because, for example, you could have like a graph that handles all of your attacks and then have a cache pose for all your attack locomotions and then use that in here without having to have that massive graph everywhere, right? So layered blimper bone has been created, and again, we're using the base. As a base, we're using the cache pose of the locomotion, which we cached here. Again, you can just drag out, search cache, and new saved cache pose. And then we use it as the base and as the source for the default slot. Remember, the default slot is what we use in here in the montage. So whenever we play that montage, it's going to run through this node. So now we need to configure the layered blend per bone, and we're going to make a branch. And in the layer setup here, we're going to expand and the branch filters. So we're going to filter from the spine bone. So from spine 01, and that's essentially this bone here, I believe. Yeah. So from that point onwards, we're going to be playing anything that's on the default slot plus the locomotion, right? So the locomotion plus anything that's going on the default slot. So that way, by default, if we're not playing anything on default slot, the locomotion gets used, so we don't lose the upper body animation. And then if we trigger something to use that default slot, we go ahead and do that. So let's just check that we've not broken anything. You can see we're still running. So even though the upper body and the lower body are now being handled separately, it's still running like you'd expect. And we just need to have a way now to play that montage. Okay, so to play the montage, again, in the slides, it suggested that you do it from the character, and we're going to do it. But again, this isn't my my favorite my favorite way of handling it. But we'll take a look at how I might handle it down the line. So we're going to just be able to press a key and play that montage, right? So if I right click and do montage, I'll play montage. You can see I can play a montage here. So what I'm going to do is first start a command. So Z, I'm going to search keyboard Z. And when I press Z, I'm going to play that montage. And I'll play anim montage. And the montage that I'm going to play is the wave. And this essentially will work now, right? So if I go ahead and play, and I really need to change my start location, but if I press Z, you'll see my character very funkily plays my animation montage. And then once the animation ends, we might shorten the animation in a second, but once the animation ends, you can see we come back, right? So maybe we should shorten the animation so we don't stay looking a bit funky for too long. But it's actually kind of cool. But you can see we can play that animation, right? That's the important thing. If we wanted to shorten the animation, we can go to the actual animation itself. And once the animation for the wave ends, we can right click here and we can say remove frame from 100 to 228. That gets rid of all of that, so now this animation's a lot shorter. And it still stays for longer than you'd probably want, but you guys get the gist. So if I play that montage again, I might have to re-add this now that I've changed the size. So I'm just going to delete that, grab that wave, pop it in again, just so it's a little bit shorter. There we go. And now I've jumped around a lot, so I'll go over this again. But essentially now I have the ability to press Z and my wave plays. And that works, right?
Okay, James, could you just quickly go over how you got it to only affect the top or the upper body?
Yeah, I'm going to go over the whole setup again because I did fumble up over a couple of things. What I won't go over is creating the animation again because I think it was fairly self-explanatory, but the layered blend per bone. So let's just delete all of this. What we had originally was just our locomotion, right? Now, we want to play an animation on the upper body and the lower body that are two different things. So to do that, we need a layered blend per bone node. Now the base pose, so whatever's the base original animation, we want that to be our locomotion, right? So ordinarily we'd plug this right in here. But because we want to play montages on this, and montages have to run through that default slot that we mentioned before, the thing about this is that if we plug it in like this, the upper body wouldn't have any animation to play because there's no source information here. So whenever this isn't playing, there's nothing feeding any other information. So we'd essentially lose the animation on the upper body. So in order to have this available in both places, because you can see I can't do that, what I need to do is cache the pose that comes out of this. So I'm going to drag out, I'm going to search cache. I'm going to call this cached locomotion. What this allows me to do is access that locomotion from wherever I want. So I can have it there, and I can also have it as the source of the default slot. And again, the important part of that is that it means that while nothing's playing on the default slot, I can still play whatever's coming before it, which is just going to be the locomotion anyways, right? So that's why we do that. Now, in terms of the actual setup of split in between the bones, that's all handled here in the layered blend per bone. So if I select it, you guys would have it look like this by default. So let's just go back. And what I'm going to is inside the config section, we set the blend mode to branch filter. We don't have to worry about that. But then the branch filter that we actually add, so branch filter is essentially what branch from where onwards are you playing something. So if I had the elbow, it'd be from the elbow to the rest of the fingers and hand. And that branch is going to be from the spine up, right? So I'm going to select spine underscore 01 because that's the name of that bone here, spine underscore 01. So from the spine 01 onwards, we play this, whatever's going on here. Now remember, we're not always playing something on the default slot, so by default it's going to be using that locomotion. I'm going to bring the character down now. It's time for you to come back down. So now, if I press Z with the rest of that setup, it plays the wave, right? And why does it play the wave? That's because in the character, we're pressing Z and we're playing the animation montage, which handles the wave, right? So that's how we do animation montages. And also on top of that, how we layer blend different things. If we didn't have a source to this, you'll notice that what will happen is that the upper body has nothing to play. So now we have essentially a very funky looking run cycle, right? So because we have the locomotion in there, we're good to go. And we can play both the animation that's the base and then the montage when we press Z. Any questions?
Yeah, there was one. If you have multiple montages, but only one of them need to blend, need to use the layer blend node, would you need to create another slot? A default
Yeah.
slot. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm using the default slot, right? But if we were doing something like this, like if I was doing this at work, I wouldn't use a default slot for this because the default slot is basically something that I define as playing somewhere, everywhere, like every bone. So what you can do is if you select that slot, you can create different slots, and you can see these have quite a lot already by default. So upper body, full body T additive pre-aim. There's a bunch of stuff here that's already done with the setup, and you can just create new slots for this. And in the past, I would have just done it here, but if I select the slot, so to make a new slot, it used to just be, oh, sorry. It used to actually just be here, but it doesn't seem like it appears anymore. I'm basically looking for the slot manager window, which might actually be in the windows now. So the anim slot manager here, I can add my own slots. And, if I wanted to just say, for example, a slot for anything that I might play just on the left arm, so I can do L arm slot. And now you have a slot that you can just find L arm. Which should appear there. So all you have to do is select this and change it to L arm slot now. Seems once you use one, you can't find it. So this would be the default slot. This can be the L arm slot. We'll make another one to be the full body. For example, for facial animation, you'd probably have a slot for that, right? Handling just the face. But yeah, slots are really, really handy because again, they allow you to play animation through that node, but you can play them from elsewhere. So I can play it from a sequencer. I can play it from a montage. I can play it directly from an animation blueprint and define a slot in it. So it's really actually quite handy to be able to use slots to just access from anywhere. But managing it can be a little bit tricky.
There was another question about, is the animation montage blending with the upper body animation, or is it overriding it, basically?
The animation montage, is it blended? So in this case, it just overrides. You can blend two, whether you actually start using that by using this, right? There's an alpha value here, basically. So I could drive that value with something to have a nice blend in, but for now, it's just a full-on replacement. Now, montages do have a blend in and out property. So if I open up the montage, sorry, I double-clicked the node. But you have a blend in and blend out. So they will blend through the actual montage itself, but it is just replacing the animation. It's not like an additive or anything like that. It's just replacing the animation from that bone onwards. Any other questions?
Yeah, I'm not sure about this one, but in the actual blend per bone node, where you select the bones, is there a way to easily select or like know which bones you have, or do you have to just type it in?
You have to just type it in. And it's weird because this node is fairly old now. It's like OG UE4 node. Because most of the newer nodes now have like a little drop down for the skeleton and its contextual, but these don't. So you just have to go to whatever bone is there, find the name. You can right click and copy the display name. So you can do that to make sure that you get the right bone. But yeah, it's not the most user-friendly experience, to be fair. And it's weird because there's a node that, still gets used daily. So it'd be nice to actually have that more contextual info. Any other questions?
I think we should be good. There's a few, but they'll be better for the lab.
Okay. So one thing I do want to bring up, because this basically brings us to the end of this course, but one thing I do want to point out is one thing I don't love about this is that we're playing an animation montage and we're handling animation from outside the animation blueprint, where the animation blueprint actually doesn't have much context of this, other than the fact that the default slot exists, right? So I'm not a huge fan of that as a general concept. I like to handle essentially all the animation work that I can inside the animation blueprint. And the reason for that is because one, animation blueprints are very efficient at handling how animations get brought in and out. They're very, very efficient at that. And memory management through the animation blueprint is essentially handled automatically, where this now would have to grab any animation that was inside that montage and have it loaded in all the time forever if the character uses it. So it's not a lovely way of doing it. So the way I would actually handle this is essentially I'd put the montage inside of the animation blueprint and we call it through the character. So it's the same thing. We still have an action that has the same reaction, but it's a little bit more cleaner and more performant. I'm going to quickly show you how I might do that. So in the event graph, remember the event graph in the animation blueprint is essentially just our normal blueprint. I'm going to make a custom event, which will be wave. And in here, I'm going to play a montage. And I'm going to do montage play, and then the montage to play is going to be that wave. So basically, essentially the same thing that we're doing here, just through the animation blueprint. So now all we have to do is, instead of playing it here, is access the animation blueprint that the character's using and then play it through there. So to do that, at begin play, I'm going to grab the animation blueprint of the character. So to do that, I'm going to get the mesh, get anim instance, and that's essentially our animation blueprint. I'm going to right click. I'm going to cast to ABP, my ABP, my NMBP. There we go. And now I'm going to store this forever so that I can access it whenever I want. So this is going to be my character ABP. So with that, I can now grab my character ABP, and when I press Z, I can do my wave. So it's a much nicer way to keep everything here. And if I had things like combos and everything like that, instead of having to constantly have them loaded and all that kind of stuff through the animation blueprint, through the character blueprint, I handle it through the animation blueprint, which is much better at understanding the context of all these animations and whether it needs them straight away or not. So the other thing as well is that jump into montage sections through the character blueprint isn't very nice. Whereas here, I can jump to montage section. So if I'm doing a combo and depending on where I press X or square, I want to jump to a specific section of the montage because I have a light attack here and then a heavy attack at the end, right? So instead of handling it pretty poorly through any other blueprint, the animation blueprint is going to let you handle that really nicely. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, this should work now, which is waving. So I press Z and I still wave, so it's doing exactly the same thing. But yeah, a little bit more efficient. So I just want to make sure that I put that as an addendum there because it's a little bit nicer. Any questions before we break out to the lab?
Yeah, someone asked, is there a difference between play animation montage and play montage?
I don't know. So play montage. Well, it looks like play montage gives you a lot of information. So you have notifies that you can put in the montage. You have uncompleted, whether it's blending out, whether it's been interrupted. So you have a lot more options to fire events off depending on what's happening inside the montage, which is rather handy. It's just that you're going to have to give, because it's this type of event, you're going to have to feed the skeletal mesh, which means you're going to have to cache the skeletal mesh like we did the character movement, which is fine, right? I can just get mesh. And if I promote this to a variable, now I have the mesh accessible. And I would just use it here to actually handle it. But yeah, it
Apparently
seems like
there's
you
a
just have
third one called montage play.
montage play is the one that I'm using
Okay,
here,
yeah.
which it basically handles, you don't have to feed any information. It knows that the context is just this. But this might be an event that you might want to do if you have a different skeletal mesh playing the thingy. So you have more access to things with this, essentially. So this could be if an enemy character does this and you are in block, just grab the information from that enemy character and once it's interrupted, do something, right? So you don't necessarily have to use this to play montages on this skeletal mesh. You can access information from another skeletal mesh or play to another skeletal mesh. I wouldn't recommend doing too much of that, but just heads up. Just trying to see if there's any. So there's all these options for montages as well. So montage with zoom, set next section. There's another one that's quite handy. You can set the next section so that instead of having to jump to a section, if you know something's going to happen, you can set the section that you're going to go to. There's a lot of really handy things that you can do with montages. And within the montage itself, there's quite a lot of nuance. So for example, if I had jump, I could say that you play this animation and then you enter this as a loop. So you can, I think it's if you, I can't remember how you do it exactly, but you are able to, yeah, you can set the number of loops that you can put in here on here. So you have quite a lot of control over what you might do with this. So I suggest that you do kind of look into montages a bit more because there is quite a lot of information that you can do. In my projects, I've actually not had to use many montages at all. Like I've just not worked on games that rely on montages too much. But yeah, they're cool. Any other questions before we break out to the lab?
Yeah, someone's asking is it more performant to use montages?
Depends on where you call them from. So remember, montage essentially, oh God, I double clicked it again. I'm too used to doing that. So montage is essentially run through a slot, right? And the slot is this node here in the anim graph, which it's listening to, depending if the logic allows it to, it's listening to that slot, right? So performance is kind of relative for this. Like depends on what you do with the montages and how often you're going to be calling them. Like I wouldn't run locomotion information, for example, through a montage. That seems like a really kind of obtuse and hard way to do it. But for what I consider sort of like events, it can be handy. Again, I do it for events that aren't directly tied to locomotion, so you can blend in and do whatever you need to, and then go back to your base locomotion. But yeah. Are they more performant? I would probably suggest that they're a little bit less, so if you can avoid them, it's probably a good thing to do, but it's not something that I think you need to really worry about. Again, unless you're starting to play it specifically, call the montage from a different blueprint that might have to have all those animations now, stored forever within it. So just keep that in mind that it's essentially like creating a hard reference to any animations that are stored in there. Whereas with the animation blueprint, it's much smarter at managing all that stuff. So it depends.
Could you show again how you call the montage within the animation blueprint instead of the character?
Yeah. So within the animation blueprint, I've got it here. But basically, I made a custom event and I called it wave, but I'll call it wave 2 for the sake of it. And then all I have to do is drag out, play, montage, and I'm going to use montage play. And then the montage to play, I just find my wave. And that's it. Now, the important thing is that this plays the montage. However, the montage, remember, plays through the slot. So your animation blueprint, or your animation graph, sorry, needs to have that slot and for the slot to be currently active for that to play. And the slot being currently active is just dependent on the node that you're using at the end of it, right? So if I had this alpha at 0, so it only ever blends the base pose, right? There's no actual blending happening. Playing the slot now would do absolutely nothing. Right? I'm pressing Z, nothing's happening. And that's because, again, it's basically dependent on that slot being active. And it's active when it's actually being read and passed through to the pose. So how you deal with this is up to you, whatever logic you want to do. But keep that in mind that basically the event graph handles playing the montage, but that montage to be visible needs to go through a slot, and the slot would be handled in the anim graph and make sure it's active at the time that you're calling it.
So there's a question, would you use this system for like a crowd system? So would you use the animation blueprint for crowds?
For crouch?
Crowds. It's like a big bunch of people.
For crowds. Oh, okay. So you can. Crowds are probably nowadays handled better with Niagara. Crowds are probably the best and cheapest way to handle it is by running the animation through the material. So essentially use vertex animation to handle loads of characters so that you don't have to read skeletal meshes. Skeletal meshes are inherently expensive, right? For a number of reasons. One, because we have to have all the skin data, bones updating, constantly basically taking information about what pose should the character be in, right? So that's expensive inherently. And if you had 120 characters that are handled in that um, via an animation blueprint and a skeletal mesh, it's probably not going to run very well. There are tools to make that run as good as it can, but just keep that in mind that it's probably not going to run amazingly. So if you're doing crowds, it's probably smarter to handle it some other way. Like Niagara is a good example. Vertex animation on static mesh is probably another decent example. But yeah, just keep that in mind. They're not cheaper. The second reason why skeletal meshes and animation blueprints in general are somewhat expensive by their nature. Again, this will happen in most games. It's also because they're very CPU intensive, right? Like so, this stuff is essentially being ran through the CPU, and it's ran on one core. It's not multi-threaded right now, right? The way I've set it up right here. In fact, a lot of the work that I've been doing lately is making animation blueprints more performant, and a lot of that is essentially sending information that I'm gathering here to other threads of the CPU so that they are handled a little bit more performantly and more in parallel. And to do that, instead of using the event graph, we've used the blueprint update animation, which, sorry, the function, which is, sorry, let me delete that. So I'd override the thread safe update animation. And this essentially is it allows you to send information to other threads, but it comes with the caveat that you can't access all the information as easily as you could, like casting and all that stuff is going to be handled, or it's not going to be able to be handled by this. So there's ways of doing it, but yeah, like ultimately, like skeletal meshes and animation blueprints in general are going to be expensive. And you know, for crowds, it's probably not the thing that I would go for. Can your game handle having 8 characters on it? It just depends on where you 8 characters in one time. It just depends on where you put in your costs, right, and where you want to optimize. But um, you can handle most games will handle animation blueprints without having to do crowds, for example, and handle 10 characters on screen. Okay, you just have to be wary of it. Again, by their nature, and this happens in every engine, skeletal meshes are going to be expensive. So, any other questions?
Yeah, so I'm asking, is there any, do you know of any good tutorials for making animations more thread safe? As it could
There's
be
a
like a lab
really good
something.
talk. I'll put it on the thingy. There's a really good talk that happened at the Prague UE Fest. Uh, Again, I could also do a lab if people are really interested in that. But there's a really good talk, and I can't remember it, but I'll link it in the lecture notes channel. And basically, it's a really good talk about how to optimize the animation blueprints, essentially. I can't remember his name, which I hate. I'm sorry. Any other questions?
There might be one more coming in, I think.
Yep,
I'll try and find that talk. Is it by Matthew Lake?
maybe. I don't know why I can't. I know his face.
The
But
talk was character and animation optimizations. I'm guessing it's that one.
I don't know. One sec. Yeah, it is this one by Matthew Lake. Cool.
Nice.
I'll really, really, really nice talk.
And just one more time, can you run through how you're calling the event for the montage in the animation blueprint?
So the event for the montage, it's literally just a custom event and then montage play and then assign that montage. Then in your character blueprint, You press Z and you call this event, which is called on the character blueprint, animation blueprint, sorry. So we need to be able to have access to that character animation blueprint. So what I did is at begin play, I cast to the animation blueprint by getting the mesh, getting the anim instance of the mesh, and this is going to return if I cast the animation blueprint. Cast my anim BP, and then I just store that variable. So once you have that variable, you can access it here. So you get your character animation BP, and then you just call whatever event you called it. And that's it. The same way you'd communicate with any other blueprint, really. It's just this is the thing that kind of gets people, like get anim instance is not just like get anim blueprint. Unless it exists nowadays, but it doesn't. So get anim instance usually will return the animation blueprint if you're using one. So any other questions? Cool. Well, thanks everybody.